Hey everybody, and welcome to the 5 Bytes Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Monahan. Coming up on this week's episode, CrowdStrike reveals root cause of the content update gone wrong. Also, Microsoft claps back at Delta Airlines after Delta's CEO publicly called out the company. And Google's existential crisis worsens after US judge rules against the tech giant. For this and more, keep listening to this episode of the podcast, which of course, as always, is brought to you by my sponsors. And that includes ControlUp, Network's Policy Pack, Numescent, and Master Packager. If you enjoy the show each week, you have these awesome sponsors to thank. And now for some news. When it rains, it pours. Azure suffered another outage that spanned about 2 hours and impacted multiple servers for customers across North America and Latin America. One such example of a service that was impacted was Azure DevOps, which was inaccessible, showing an error explaining that the service was unavailable. Once again, the impacted services were some of those that leveraged Azure Front Door. The outage was caused by a configuration change which Microsoft subsequently rolled back. This, of course, as I alluded to with my "when it rains it pours" line, is not the first Azure outage in recent weeks. Of course, one of those outages happened to occur around the same time as the beginning of the CrowdStrike incident, so it got a little bit buried in the news. I just wonder if the scale of the CrowdStrike incident may also make outages like this one on Azure that lasted a couple of hours, or like some of the Cloudflare outages that we've experienced in the recent months, just seem minor in comparison. But it's not minor. These kinds of problems can affect businesses in a major way, even if they only last a couple of hours. But not only that, there are some service and support reliability issues that can cause problems for companies too. And I saw my buddy David O'Brien, the founder of Argos, shared the impact of a recent change his organization made, which was a supposedly successful deployment of code that left 3 out of 4 function apps in an error state. Their service was impacted as they spent over 30 hours trying to get help from Microsoft support before eventually just backing out their supposedly successful configuration change. I feel like right now we could be in a seminal moment for cloud services. Obviously, cloud services provide tremendous benefits, but as CIO pointed out, executives may now be reassessing their reliance on the cloud, and so many back-to-back outages and service challenges, which in part, in my opinion, is because of a lack of visibility of what goes on the back end with some of the Azure services, could end up leaving a lasting impression that drives customers back to their own private data centers and in-house built solutions. CrowdStrike has revealed the root cause of the content update gone wrong. ABC in Australia explains that when CrowdStrike updates are deployed for the Falcon sensors, it changes the location or the number of sensors to check for a potential attack. In this instance, Falcon expected the update to have 20 input fields, but it had 21 input fields. This count mismatch is what caused the crash. The root cause analysis report stated, quote, "The content interpreter expected only 20 values. Therefore, the attempt to access the 21st value produced an out-of-bounds memory read beyond the end of the input data array and resulted in a system crash." End quote. And I have to say credit to some of the internet sleuths who were sharing their analysis of crash dumps. You know, some were quick to kind of lash out at them and say they were spreading misinformation, and in some cases, it still was misinformation, but some were not a million miles away from the truth, it seems. This seems to have been caused by an out-of-bounds memory error. CrowdStrike has gone on the defense against Delta Airlines with claims that Delta's extended IT outage was caused by poor disaster recovery plans and the airline refusing to accept free on-site help in restoring Windows devices. As covered on the previous episode of the podcast, Delta was particularly hard hit by the incident, with their service impacted for about 5 days, with claims that it cost the company upwards of $500 million. In their claim, Delta said CrowdStrike offered nothing but free consulting advice to help. CrowdStrike claims they offered Delta free on-site assistance to help recover Windows devices. and they got no immediate response, and according to bleepingcomputer.com, CrowdStrike was ultimately told that it was not needed. CrowdStrike also questioned why Delta's competitors who face similar challenges could restore operations quicker, implicating that faulty procedures and infrastructure were partly responsible for the airline's lengthy outages. As part of the lawsuit, CrowdStrike has asked Delta to maintain a copy of all relevant communications for the case, whilst also urging Delta to reconsider its approach. Microsoft also came under fire by the Delta CEO, who publicly stated, quote, "When was the last time you heard of a big outage at Apple?" and suggested that Microsoft has probably the most fragile platform as well. For Microsoft's part, they clapped back pretty significantly, stating, quote, "Microsoft empathizes with Delta and its customers regarding the impact of the CrowdStrike incident, but your letter and Delta's public comments are incomplete, false, misleading, and damaging to Microsoft and its reputation." Even though Microsoft software had not caused the CrowdStrike incident, Microsoft immediately jumped in and offered to assist Delta at no charge following the July 19th outage. Each day that followed from July 19th through July 23rd, Microsoft employees repeated their offers to help Delta. Each time, Delta turned down Microsoft's offers to help, even though Microsoft would not have charged Delta for this assistance. End quote. According to a report by WindowsCentral.com, a Delta employee told Microsoft that the company was, quote, "all good," end quote, according to the letter. That claim by the employee reportedly occurred on July 22, 2024, which is the same day Delta canceled over 1,100 flights. And also, Microsoft claims that they reached out to Delta and offered assistance July 19th through July 23rd. So even after that employee said, the company was all good, even the next day, again, Microsoft reached out to offer assistance. It was also suggested that Delta likely refused Microsoft's help because the IT system it was most having trouble restoring, its crew tracking and scheduling system, was being serviced by other technology providers such as IBM because it runs on those provider systems and not on Microsoft Windows or Azure. There has been inferences made in the Wall Street Journal that Delta may have been the worst affected airline due to a reliance on outdated technology. So perhaps that outdated technology is that which they have from IBM, possibly. There is a whole lot more on this back and forth and opinions being shared by people that are smarter than I am. But to that question that the CEO asked, when was the last time you heard of a big outage at Apple? I would call BS on that, because when was Apple ever used by the majority of enterprises in the world? And when were they ever required to support their operating systems for 10 plus years at a time? It's just not a good comparison to make, in my opinion. The case will also be interesting from the perspective of how much does Microsoft know about Delta's systems, because their letter seems to suggest they know quite a bit. So it'll be interesting to see, just by the nature of how ubiquitous Microsoft is in enterprise, does that mean they also glean important information for them to be able to pose a decent defense? Because it sounds like they already have a decent defense case built already. It'd be interesting to see if this one goes to trial and if any evidence comes out to suggest that Microsoft knows more than Delta perhaps realizes that Microsoft could know. So that could be an interesting angle on this whole thing. So I guess we'll watch how this one plays out. Dell is set to lay off 12,500 employees, which is around 10% of its global workforce. Within the last 12 months, they had also previously laid off 13,000 employees, so they will have laid off a massive 25,500 employees in the span of 12 months, according to techzine.eu. Dell have said they want to focus more on AI and is cutting its workforce again to that end. This mainly involves streamlining sales departments and management layers. This latest reorganization will affect especially the go-to-market teams. Sales directors Bill Scannell and John Byrne say, quote, "We are becoming a leaner company," end quote, when discussing the latest round of layoffs. It is certainly an interesting story in the context that it was Dell employees who refused to return to the office when the policy was changed, and they made the policy so that Employees who elected to stay working from home primarily would not be able to apply for promotions or be promoted within the organization. So is this partly a strategical move to get rid of some of those employees who preferred to work from home for most of the time? I'm not sure, and Dell does not seem to be suggesting that. But obviously 12,500 is a huge number of employees. 10% is a large percentage. And I guess like companies who want to invest in AI, they're not going to do it and hurt the bottom line of the company. They're probably going to do things like lay off employees and then spend that money that's recouped in investing in implementing AI. But it's also going to be pretty difficult when you've laid off a lot of your people to actually implement AI effectively, because it still does require humans passing the parameters and using the technology to get the most out of it. A U.S. judge has ruled that Google has acted illegally as a monopoly in the search and online advertising market. While the judgment was ruled against Google, at this time it's unclear yet what penalties Google and Alphabet will face as a result of the decision. The fines or other remedies will be decided in a future hearing, but the U.S. government has asked for structural relief, which could, in theory at least, mean the breakup of the company, which is something that has been reported on in previous months too. In his decision, U.S. District Judge Amit Mehta said Google had paid billions to ensure it is the default search engine on smartphones and browsers. In a 277-page opinion, Judge Mehta said, quote, "Google is a monopolist and it has acted as one to maintain its monopoly." The judge went on to conclude that being the default search engine is extremely valuable real estate for Google, which interestingly means Google's attempt at a defense of suggesting that Bing and others provide considerable competition must have fell on deaf ears. Alphabet said it plans to appeal against this ruling, saying, quote, "The decision recognizes that Google offers the best search engine, but concludes that we shouldn't be allowed to make it easily accessible," end quote, which... yeah, that's a very generous interpretation of that ruling. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland hailed the ruling, stating, quote, "It's a historic win for the American people. No company, no matter how large or influential, is above the law," end quote. So we'll have to keep an eye out for the ruling on what the fines or actions will be required as a result of this. And we should also keep an eye out for the other numerous pending cases in the US and Europe that Google is currently facing. Google has confirmed that they introduced a bug into a recent Chrome update that was rolled out to about half of Chrome users on Sunday night. Users noticed files could no longer be dragged into another Chrome window or be used to open a new Chrome window. It was caused by a new performance-enhancing feature, UI Pump Improvements Win, and it's possible that you may have got the update but didn't even notice that this broke if you didn't use this functionality. But hopefully, regardless, by the time you hear this episode of the podcast, that update has been rolled back for you and it's no longer an issue. Which is also interesting because, Chrome security updates are supposed to be rolled out every week, but because of the update mechanism in their custom installer and the fact that they're using that scheduled task to check periodically, they're able to do things like push updates more regularly than perhaps you have realized you've signed up for, which, given the recent news with the CrowdStrike incident, that might need to be rethought by enterprises who are currently enabling that. Speaking of Chrome, on a previous episode of the podcast, I covered Chrome's Manifest v3 feature for extensions that has been in the work for years. When I covered in the past, people had noticed that the uBlock Origin Chrome extension would no longer work in v3, and the vendor was instructing its customers to instead use a light version. Well, recently Chrome users have been seeing warnings pop up indicating that, quote, "This extension may soon no longer be supported," with links asking the user to, quote, "remove or replace it with similar extensions," end quote. And this is being seen in the Chrome Web Store. For some extensions, if you're not seeing that popping up, you may actually see it once you go into Chrome://extensions. So even if you're not seeing it and you think, well, Mine are going to keep working regardless of what version of Manifest is rolled out. You may want to think again and just check your extensions to see if there's any warning messages. And I guess all of this occurring now and these pop-ups occurring now makes sense because it was supposed to trickle out through the non-stable channels beginning in June. Users will be able to manually re-enable V2 extensions for a short time, but over time Google says this toggle will go away. Fortunately, the shift for enterprise Chrome deployments is expected to be put off until June 2025, so for enterprise customers, there should be no immediate impact. In an update to a story on last week's episode of the podcast, Intel will be releasing a microcode update to prevent further damage to crashing 13th and 14th generation desktop processors sometime this month, which in itself is not really news because I'd already reported that would be coming in the next few weeks. This fix should be available via BIOS updates from PC and motherboard makers and from Microsoft via Windows updates. Unfortunately, it will not help those already damaged as they will not be fixed by the microcode update. According to Ars Technica, in an effort to provide peace of mind to buyers and cover anyone whose CPU is subtly damaged but not showing signs of instability yet, Intel is extending the warranty on all affected 13th and 14th generation CPUs by an additional 2 years. So that's where the actual news is for this week. This does raise the warranty on a new boxed Intel CPU from 3 years to 5 years, and it applies to both previously purchased processors and new ones that are bought from today onward, according to Ars Technica. For processors that came installed in pre-built PCs, Intel says users are covered, but that they should reach out to their PC's manufacturer for support. Those customers should only contact Intel directly if they have a problem getting a new CPU from their PC company. Just a reminder, the Microsoft Store for Business and Microsoft Store for Education portals will retire on August 15, 2024, so just days away. Microsoft has once again shared links on information to update to Intune integration with the Microsoft Store on Windows, as well as an FAQ for those who need more information. If you are using offline licensing, you can use the winget download command to continue to access offline applications and license files if required. I noticed over on Slashdot that a user shared the fact that Mozilla is now to distrust Entrust certificates as a root certificate authority. This comes shortly after Google also made the move to drop Entrust as a CA, saying that they noted a pattern of concerning behaviors from the company. Entrust has apologized to Google, Mozilla, and the wider web community, outlining its plans to regain the trust of browsers, but these appear to be unsatisfactory to both Google and Mozilla. And I believe Google dinged Entrust for the misissuance of certificates, and even after being questioned and pulled up on some certificates being misissued, they continued to do so. In an email shared by Mozilla's Ben Wilson, the root store manager said the decision was not taken lightly, but equally Entrust's response to Mozilla's concerns did not inspire confidence that the situation would materially change for the better. They said Mozilla previously requested that Entrust provide a detailed report on the incidents and their root causes, an evaluation of Entrust's recent actions in light of their previous commitments given in the aftermath of similarly serious incidents in 2020, and a proposal for how Entrust will reestablish Mozilla and the community's trust. So it seems like the ball is in Entrust court now to show up in a meaningful way and show how they're going to make changes. TLS version 1 and 1.1 support will be removed for new and existing Azure storage accounts starting November 2024. So this one's just a few months away. They say to avoid disruptions to your applications connecting to Azure storage, you must migrate to TLS 1.2 and remove dependencies on TLS version 1.0 and 1.1 by October 31st, 2024. So if you're using Azure storage accounts, good idea to make sure you're not dependent on these versions of TLS so you're not caught up in any craziness once they go away. But now for this episode's scripts, tricks, and tips. First up, David O'Brien and Erica Zellick shared a tip for anyone wanting to restrict users from starting free trials of Microsoft 365 apps like Power Apps. You go to admin.microsoft.com, go to Settings, Org Settings, User-Owned Apps and Services, and unselect the Starting Trials on behalf of your organization option. So this is a good idea to prevent users from starting free trials of services you likely don't want them to try. Next up, Martin Himkin shared his Intune network requirement script, which you can use to test network connections to various Intune services using PowerShell. So if you're trying to implement Intune in your environment and you want to make sure that from a network perspective, all things are good, you can run this script. Or perhaps if you're already using Intune and maybe your company acquired a new company and you want to make sure that that new company is able to get your applications from Intune, this script could be useful. And finally, Luis Fries shared the ultimate guide for first-time presenters at Microsoft 365 and Power Platform community calls. So that one's very specific to that particular community. But I would say that, something I've brought up on previous episodes of this podcast and the Thrive It podcast is that I feel like there aren't too many new faces popping up in our space and presenting at conferences and user groups. So I would encourage people to use resources like this and perhaps maybe test the waters and become a first-time presenter. And if anyone wants to be a first-time presenter and they're a little bit nervous to do it by themselves and you'd like some mentoring or to work with a co-presenter, then reach out to people who've done it in the past like me. I'd be happy to co-present with a first-time presenter if that's something that helps. But that's it for this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening and putting up with the audio this week, because I'm sure it does not sound as normal because I am sick this week and my voice is off. So apologies, and I hope my voice is back to normal for next week and things get back to business as usual.